Brutal history, the Opium Wars, 1839-1860. Imagine a government so addicted to profit that it deliberately flooded another nation with drugs, knowing it would destroy millions of lives, all to balance its books. That wasn't a cartel, that wasn't a crime syndicate. It was the British Empire, and the victim was China. The story of the Opium Wars is one of greed and arrogance, of guns and gunboats, of a civilization forced to its knees, not by invasion alone, but by addiction. It's a brutal history that reshaped the balance of power across the globe and left scars that still linger today. By the late 18th century, Britain's appetite for Chinese goods had become insatiable. Tea in particular was no longer a luxury, it was a national obsession. By 1800, Britain was importing more than 20 million pounds of tea annually, fueling not just the drawing rooms of the elite, but the daily rituals of common labourers. The problem was, Britain had nothing China wanted in return. The emperor viewed Western goods as cheap, crude, and unworthy. He demanded payment in silver bullion. For Britain, this was a financial hemorrhage. Silver was draining from London's treasury at a staggering pace, destabilizing the economy and threatening imperial power. The empire's solution was as cynical as it was deadly. In British-controlled India, vast stretches of land were devoted to the cultivation of the opium poppy. The resin could be processed into a narcotic that China had long banned because of its addictive grip on society. Britain knew it was illegal, Britain knew it was destructive, and Britain didn't care. The East India Company turned opium into one of the most profitable commodities in history, and smugglers moved it into China by the ton. At first, it trickled into coastal provinces, but soon addiction spread inland. Farmers began smoking it to dull the pain of endless toil. Scholars used it to escape mental strain. Soldiers grew dependent, nodding off while on duty. By the 1830s, China was drowning. Historians estimate that by mid-century, between 10 and 12 million people were addicted. The consequences were catastrophic. Collapsed families, ruined harvests, weakened armies. China's silver, once hoarded in imperial treasuries, now flowed out to pay for more poison, reversing centuries of prosperity. The Qing emperor could no longer ignore it. In 1839, he appointed Lin Zexu, a respected scholar and moralist, to crush the trade. Lin was incorruptible, a rarity in a bureaucracy riddled with officials who themselves smoked opium. His mission was clear: defend the empire's dignity, stop the smuggling, and save China from collapse. Lin knew he was up against more than just smugglers. He was challenging the most powerful empire on earth. In a desperate appeal, Lin wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, asking how a nation that prided itself on Christianity could profit from the mass destruction of another people. "By what right," he asked, "do you send this poison into our land?" His letter was ignored. So Lin acted. In Canton, he surrounded foreign warehouses and demanded surrender of their stockpiles. Over 20,000 chests of opium, nearly £3 million, were seized. For days, workers dumped the drug into trenches, mixed it with lime and salt, and flushed it into the sea. It was one of the largest acts of drug destruction in history, a bold stand against one of the world's most powerful economies. The British called it theft. They demanded compensation, and when none came, they sent in the gunboats. The First Opium War began in 1839, and from the outset it was a massacre. Britain was the industrial superpower of its age. Its navy boasted steam-powered warships clad in iron, armed with long-range cannons. China's defences were antiquated, wooden junks and coast forts from another era. In battle after battle, the Qing were humiliated. At Chunpi, British shells tore through Chinese fleets. At the Battle of the Bogue, fortifications crumbled within hours. Villagers watched in terror as entire towns burned. Refugees fled inland by the thousands. For Britain, the war was not about honour but about markets. They wanted access to Chinese ports, legal rights for their traders, and repayment for the destroyed opium. For China, it was about survival. But survival proved impossible against such overwhelming firepower. By 1842, the Qing had no choice but to surrender. The Treaty of Nanjing was the first of what the Chinese would call the unequal treaties. It forced China to pay Britain a staggering indemnity, essentially reparations for resisting exploitation. 5 ports were opened to foreign trade, stripping China of economic sovereignty. British citizens gained extraterritorial rights, meaning they were above Chinese law, and Hong Kong was ceded, a humiliation that would linger for more than a century. Yet the opium continued to pour in. Despite the war, despite the treaty, Britain and other Western powers pushed harder than ever. The profits were too great. By the 1850s, addiction was so widespread that entire provinces struggled to maintain order. The social fabric of China was unraveling. In rural villages, fathers pawned tools, mothers sold heirlooms, and children were left hungry as families squandered wealth for another pipe. In the cities, dens filled with the stench of smoke and despair. This collapse fed wider unrest. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history, erupted in 1850. Tens of millions would die. While opium was not the sole cause, the weakened state of the Qing dynasty, hollowed out by addiction and drained by war, was a key factor. And still, Britain wanted more. In 1856, the Chinese boarded a vessel called the Arrow, suspected of piracy. The British used this incident as a pretext to demand new concessions. When China resisted, the Second Opium War began. This time, Britain had an ally, France, eager to expand its influence in Asia. The war was even more devastating than the first. British and French forces marched inland, capturing cities, bombarding forts, and spreading terror. In 1860, they reached Beijing itself. When Chinese negotiators tried to stall, Western troops turned to an act of cultural annihilation. The Summer Palace, one of the greatest treasures of Chinese civilization, a sprawling masterpiece of gardens, pavilions, and ancient relics, was looted and then torched. Priceless art was stolen. Centuries of history went up in flames. It was a message carved in fire. Defy us, and your culture itself will burn. The treaties that followed carved China open like a carcass. More ports were opened, foreigners gained the right to travel deep into the interior, and missionaries flooded the countryside. Most humiliating of all, the opium trade was legalized. What had begun as an illegal racket was now enshrined in international law. The impact was catastrophic. By the mid-19th century, estimates suggest that 1 out of every 10 Chinese men was addicted. The economy faltered as labor productivity collapsed. The military, already behind in technology, was crippled by soldiers' 2 days to fight. Families disintegrated. Entire communities lost a generation to smoke and ash, and foreign powers kept pushing. The United States, Russia, Germany, all demanded their own spheres of influence. China was no longer the Middle Kingdom, the proud heart of Asia. It was a fractured, humiliated nation, forced to kneel before foreign powers. This period is remembered in China as the century of humiliation, and it began with the Opium Wars. The wars weakened the Qing dynasty beyond repair, leaving it vulnerable to internal rebellion and foreign domination. They marked the beginning of a global shift as Western powers imposed their will on the East, not through diplomacy, but through addiction and firepower. And yet, in Britain, the wars were celebrated. Politicians boasted of expanded markets. Merchants counted their profits. The British public enjoyed cheaper tea, never questioning the human cost behind their daily cups. The story of the Opium Wars is not just a story of two nations It's a story of how one empire could cloak mass exploitation under the language of trade and progress. When we look back, the brutality is clear. A superpower turned narcotics into a weapon. An ancient civilization was hollowed out from within. Millions suffered, not by accident, but by design. This was not war in the traditional sense. It was economic warfare, psychological warfare, cultural warfare, and it succeeded. The echoes of the Opium Wars still reverberate today. China's deep suspicion of Western motives, its fierce determination to never again be humiliated, its drive for sovereignty and strength, all trace back to the century that began with British gunboats and crates of opium. Hong Kong itself, handed back only in 1997, stood as a living reminder of how far a nation can fall when power is stripped away. The question that lingers is this: how does a so-called civilized empire justify mass addiction, cultural destruction, and centuries of suffering, all for profit? The truth is, they didn't justify it, they simply did it, because they could, because no one could stop them, and because in their eyes the suffering of millions mattered less than the profit of a few. The Opium Wars were not just about drugs, they were about greed, they were about power, they were about the arrogance of empire and the cold calculation that human life is expendable when weighed against gold. This is not just a chapter in history, it is one of the darkest bargains humanity has ever struck. And that is brutal history.